Hello, Blue Valley. This is Mr. Hume with another one of our First Chapter Fridays. I'm the librarian at Blue Valley Middle School, so I'm happy to be with you today. Uh, I get a lot of requests for students who are looking for books for animals and dogs and things like that. They just really enjoy reading about animals, and I have one I'm going to read to you today that are about animals and preserving animals. It's a really fascinating story called "A Circle of Elephants." So I'm going to read both the prologue, which kind of gives you an idea what this is about, and the first chapter, which is very short on this, and hopefully it'll be something that you would like to look into reading for the rest to yourself. So this is A Circle of Elephants by Eric Dinerstein. Prologue. I once heard a story about a lonely elephant. The elephant lived in a mountain forest bordering a great ocean. Many elephants had lived in this forest, but now there was only one, an old male with giant tusks. The others had been killed for their ivory. Poachers tried several times to trap the old male too, but they could not. The hunters soon feared the tusker, believing that he was a spirit elephant, too dangerous to approach. The game warden learned of the spirit elephant and began to track him. The warden was determined to protect the animal. He watched as the tusker spent his days wandering the forest, calling out to the others and listening for their trumpets in return, but none called back. One day the elephant climbed to the top of a ridge. He trumpeted to his lost family. Again, no one answered. Then the elephant entered a clearing with a view of the sea. The warden stayed nearby, unafraid, as the elephant looked out over the ocean. The air vibrated around him, but the warden could not make out any sound. He followed the elephant's gaze with his binoculars. Why would this powerful elephant stare out to sea, rumbling deeply to no one? Far away, the warden spotted a pod of humpback whales migrating along the coast. They broke the surface and rose high into the air before splashing back into the water. Had the whales called back to the elephant? The tusker stayed on the ridge for a week. The pod remained along the coast as well. Maybe, the warden thought, the whales stayed so long to comfort the lonely male. I think of this elephant often. I have even told his story to Hira Prashad, my giant tusker who leads our stable. There is a feeling in me, one so deep I cannot name it. I believe Hira Prashad feels it too, that our purpose in life is to look out for each other. We are brothers, and together Hira Prashad and I must watch over the other animals that live at the mercy of humans. We must answer the call of the lonely trumpeters. Nandu, the king's elephant driver. Thakarandara, Nepal. All right, so this is part one of the book, chapter one. To ride on elephant back is to float above the world. It is to be with the birds and the monkeys in the trees, where their whistles and hoots ring in your ears. Gliding above the dirt and dust is a privilege, especially for me, a 13-year-old Tibetan orphan, and the youngest elephant driver in all of Nepal. It is only when I get down from my elephant that the trouble starts. On New Year's Day, I rode with my tusker, Hira Prashad, to the highest point along the Great Sandbar River, 2 hours north and west of our elephant stable. This spot is called Lamati, named for its red clay cliffs. Bright green cattails sway in the foreground. Behind them, white sandbars reach out to the other bluffs and rippling water. We paused at the top of the cliffs to take in the moment. To me, this is the most beautiful place in the Borderlands jungle, as wild and far from people as you can find. Maybe the isolation is the source of the real beauty. I think this place is Hira Prashad's favorite too. He rumbles each time we approach it. This will be our tradition, I said as I rubbed the top of his head. On New Year's Day we will come to these cliffs. Hira Prashad flapped his ears and lifted his trunk to the river. It had been almost 6 months since Dilly, my closest friend, and I found Hira Prashad. He was being starved to death, chained to a tree in a courtyard of the local landlord we called the Python. The sight of the elephant's thin body and sunken eyes was too much for us to bear. Dilly and I bargained with that python to sell us Hira Prashad. We saved my tusker's life that day, and he has never forgotten it. The Nepali New Year is a day to celebrate and thank the gods. It is now the day we mark our brotherhood. On my command, Hira Prashad dropped to his knees and rolled to his side so I could climb off his back. He rose to his feet again and began grazing in the grassland, ripping the tall shoots from the curled trunk and stuffing them into his mouth. My tusker was hungry. He ate and ate while I wandered. Soon I heard the dull thuds of elephant dung hitting the ground behind me. Fortunately, the smell was sweet, like the grass elephants eat. I made my way to the edge of the cliff. The swift current of the river swept along far below me. There had been no rain for months, but even in this drought the depth here was over my head. The cold, clear water of the Great Sandbar is fed by the melting snows of the high Himalayas, straight north from where I stood. In the middle of the river, near a maze of sandbars, two narrow, half-submerged logs began to roll. I focused my binoculars to discover that they were female gharials, a rare ancient crocodile that still lives along this river. Like a dinosaur, the gharial has scaly peaks along his back and a long, thin snout to grab fish out of the river. I scanned the far bank, beyond the gharial where movement caught my eye. The rising heat waves made it difficult to see clearly, but I knew it was a wild elephant, a female with a small calf. Both were looking up at us on the ridge. I have heard stories that when an old elephant dies at your stable, she is reborn in the next life as a wild elephant that lives across the Great Sandbar River. I wondered if that young calf was my elephant mother, Devi Kali, the only mother I've ever known, who died over a year ago. I hoped it was her, enjoying her next life. Suddenly I felt Hira Prashad at my side. I never cease to be amazed how quietly elephants can move. The pads under their feet absorb all sound. Look, Hira Prashad, I said, that may be our mother across the river. Devi Kali, I had learned, was Hira Prashad's mother too. She had been separated from her as a baby, just as I had been separated from my birth parents. Hira Prashad's soft rumbling turned into a long grumble, ending with a loud trumpet. What is it? The roar from the river made it difficult to hear, but I thought the wild elephant had trumpeted as well. Hira Prashad rumbled again and stepped forward, wrapping his trunk around my chest and pulling me backward. I cried out, but Hira Prashad ignored me. He had never done such a thing before. Chi! Chi! I shouted the elephant command to let me go and kicked my legs as hard as I could. I was helpless and terrified that Hira Prashad was going to toss me into the river. He grabbed me even tighter around the waist with his trunk. What are you doing, Hira Prashad? I yelled. For the first time ever, I was afraid of my brother elephant. I struggled to free myself, slapping at his trunk. He carried me 20 feet from the cliff's edge before he put me down and started swinging his trunk, herding me back from the cliff. Hira Prashad's angry rumbles kept me moving back further and further. Our roles had reversed. The elephant was commanding the driver. Scared, I took giant steps backward. I could not believe he would hurt me, but in my mind I heard the words of my father. Subha Sahib, the officer in charge of our stable. Remember, Nandu, our elephants are still wild animals. We must humble ourselves to ride them. Hira Prashad pushed me into the grassland. I was so confused I failed to notice the dead silence. No peacocks, wild jungle fowl, or hornbills calling. Only seconds ago they had all been wailing. A nearby herd of spotted deer, over 100 of them, stopped barking and stood at attention. At first I thought they were watching the lone wild dog, the dhole, that I had saw darting through the clearing, but the deer seemed focused on something else. Hira Prashad sensed it too. He banged his trunk on the ground and let out a screech I have never heard from an elephant. Hira Prashad, I yelled. What do you know that you're not telling me? Just as I spoke, every tree around us started to shake. My head nodded up and down, and my arms wiggled left and right. I moved toward the elephant, but lost my balance as the earth swayed beneath my feet. I stumbled and fell. Hira Prashad lifted me up and put me further into the grassland. I heard a loud ripping as the place where I had been standing, the entire cliff edge, collapsed into the river. 2 trees bent over and fell, tearing the ground with their huge roots as they landed. The entire jungle trembled. More of the cliff sheared off and crashed into the river. Hira Prashad curled his trunk around me and held me to his leg, just as Devi Kali did when I was small. I pressed my face into his rough, warm skin, praying to the goddess of the forest, the one that we call Bandavi. I pleaded with her to make it end. Instead, another great silk cotton tree went crashing down over the edge. The jungle was caving in around us, and no one could stop it. So, here's a book about a relationship between a boy and his elephant, which is not one that you hear all the time. If you're interested in that, please check it out at your library, and hopefully you can find out what happened. Thanks for listening.